I want to thank you for allowing us to come here and together to study how to reach your chosen people. Lord, you are the one to lead us, and without your help, we can do nothing. And so I ask for your help tonight as we explore further into the Jewish writings. In the name of your Son, Yeshua. Amen. So today, it's been so many weeks and months, right? Several months we've got together last. Um, but I'm glad we're into it. And we're actually going to step backwards in time from where we were, because we were up to the 10th century. And now we're going to go back to the first century. And there's a reason why that I structured this class that way. We are going to look at the, it didn't move forward. There we go. We're going to look at the historians. And specifically, we're going to look at Flavius Josephus and Tacitus. Now, Tacitus, I'm only going to give a courtesy to because he is a Roman historian, considered by many, many people the best Roman historian. But Josephus is very much a part of Jewish.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Can you spell this Tacitus person? Are you saying Tacitus or are you saying someone else?
Tacitus. No, Tacitus. You're right.
Okay, thank you.
Tacitus. Tacitus. His Josephus, we see quoted in the Talmud. We see it through other Jewish writings. There are two sides as to whether he's loved or hated. Is he loved because he was Jewish, or because he the Benedict Arnold of Jews, because he became a Roman citizen and he sided with the emperor of Rome, and it became a problem. So we're talking about the historians, and specifically Tacitus. He was born approximately 56 CE or AD, as some people still refer to it, and he lived until 120. So he lived during the time period at the start of Christianity. And if you really want to know what the persecution of the early church was, this is the historian that you go to. He was first and foremost a Roman historian, but he was also a politician. And he is widely regarded as one of the greatest Roman historians by modern scholars. Most of his work, unfortunately, has been lost to history. There are references to it. There are 5 works ascribed to Tacitus that have survived. There are gaps, however, but the most substantial are the annals and the histories. This canon, with the approximate dates, are the first one he came out was the life of an Agricola, and that came out in 98. Then Germania, he was about the conquest of Germany, also came out in 98. The dialogue on oratory, that's not pronounced right. Oratory. The dialogue on oratory is his dialogue on how you should act as a politician, and the how other people have interacted. And finally, we come to his 2 big works. Histories came out in 105, and the Annals came out in 117. The surviving portions of his 2 major works, the Annals and the Histories, examine the reigns of the emperors Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, and those who reigned in the year of the 4 emperors. In other words, 69. There was a time period when some of the emperors only lived 6 months before they were assassinated. There are 2 works that span the history of the Roman Empire. These 2 works span the history of the Roman Empire from the death of Augustus in 14 CE to the death of Domitian in 96 CE, although there are some substantial gaps in the surviving text, because there were he approximately made this work of 30 books, and some of them survived, and it's kind of amazing that they did survive at all, given what happened in Rome. The Annals, Tacitus' final work, covers the period from the death of Augustus in 14 CE to 66 CE, so just before the temple was destroyed. He wrote at least 16 books. The books 7 to 10, parts of books 5, 6, 11, and 16 are missing. Book 6 ends with the death of Tiberius, and 7 and 12 presumably covered the reigns of Catigilia and Claudius. The remaining books cover the reign of Nero, perhaps until his death in 68 or until the end of that year. But unfortunately, the last half of that book is missing. And to connect to the histories, that was his other book. The second half of the book is 16, ending with the events in 66. It is not known whether Tacitus completed the work. He died before he complete his planned histories. But the Annals is one of the earliest secular historical records to mention Christ, which it does in connection with Nero's persecution of the Christians. So if you want to understand the persecution of the Christian church during the Roman time period, as well as the Roman rule, this is the work that you go to. Now, he wrote it in Latin, but there's many qualified English translations. Obviously, Latin is a pretty foundational language. This is both of my daughters read and wrote it and spoke it. So it's still a language that is very much used, just like Greek. So if you
David,
want to understand, yes.
where would you find the books of Josephus? Where would you look for them at?
On Josephus, I'm going to give you.
Oh, you're looking at Tacitus. Okay, I'm sorry.
Tacitus, you go to Amazon and order his book, right?
Oh, okay. Is there any library where you can find them?
If you go to a university, I do not know if it's available in a public library. I
Okay.
do know that universities have them because it's Roman history. It's basic Roman history. And basically, to be honest with you, if you get a good book on Roman history, they're going to cite him over and over, unless you want the sources. And we're going to read a source material, though it is a translation of Josephus, and you'll see it's not easy to read, right? You really have to parse it. I like some of the more modern translations. It's like people say the King James is the infallible word of God. I want to see a single person today, other than an academic, read the 1611 King James. They don't. They read a modern English version of that version. They've changed the language. If you go back and look at a 1611 Middle English, it is difficult to read, right? But people that read the King James Version today, they go, oh, this is it. It's just been, the language has been updated, but it is still not the best version out there. There's far superior versions of the Bible for translation accuracy than King James. But it's the same thing when you read. If you cannot understand it, it's irrelevant. When I talk to people, I was down at the Baptist church today, and they were asking me, well, what's the best Bible to read? And I says, look, the Bible that you understand is the best Bible to read. If you want to get to an academic level, I can recommend a couple Bibles, but I don't care if it's the Living Bible. If that's the Bible that reaches your heart and teaches you the gospel message, then that's the Bible you should read. Is it accurate? No. If you've read the Living Bible, you go, whoa, it's not. But if it teaches the gospel message, you have to, they have a street vernacular form of the Bible, which I was reading. It's kind of entertaining to read, but the language is like rough, right? Rough, street vernacular. But you know what? If that reaches that person with the gospel message, then maybe they'll move into something a little more accurate. So we come to Flavius Josephus. There's not, you'll never hear him, very rarely hear him called by his full name. He's called Josephus. He lived in 37. He's approximately, they believed he was born in 37, and he lived to circa 100. He was a Roman. While he was Jewish, he got his Roman citizenship under Titus. He was a Jewish historian and a military leader. He actually led the war against Rome and then joined Rome. So that's why he has a problem with being called, why they call him the Benedict Arnold of the Jews. He's best known for writing a book called The Jewish War, and it really describes the war of Rome against the Jews. He was born in Jerusalem, so obviously he's a Judean. His father was of the priestly descent, and his mother claimed Hasmonean ancestry. And I say that term in quotes because while he said that, there is no direct line that can be accurately show that she was directly descended from the Hasmonean leaders. But that's his claim, so we're going to accept it as what it is. The Jewish War is one of his major works, and the Antiquities of the Jews. We're going to look at sections out of those two books because they have relevance to us in what we do and what we study. And they also really are the, other than Tacitus, they're the only books that back up the Bible. And you really, if you, and I'm talking about, because the Bible is not a historical document, even though people want to say it's a historical document, and we use historicity as a means of study. It is not, was never meant to exactly cite history as a historian would cite it. Now, we've been going through the book of Acts, and the book of Acts is a history. But as we look at it, there's big chunks of it missing, right? And it doesn't explain the why and wherefore. And that's kind of important when you're talking about history. You need to understand it. But the works of Josephus provide crucial information about the first Jewish-Roman war. They represent an important literary source material for understanding the context of the Dead Sea Scrolls and late Temple Judaism. In other words, while there are some who will say he was a Pharisee, he was definitely of the Sadducean sect. He was an individual that came from wealth. His family was associated with the temple. As he said, his dad was a priest. So obviously the priestly line were Sadducees at this time. The works of Josephus include useful material for historians about individuals, groups, custom, and geographical places. One of the things that you don't see when you study history, they're not real specific on the geography. When we look at Josephus, he is very specific about where he's at, what's going on, what the landscape was like. They have used Josephus to find cities in Judea that have been completely wiped out. They were wiped out by the Romans, do not exist. But using his descriptions of that city, of its location, of the topography, they have went and found those cities. And there are many, many of those that they scrupulously really go through his work line by line and go back and prove these things that people say are not true, i.e. Jericho, right? How many of you have heard the story that Jericho was never happened? That was a long-standing stance in academia, that Jericho was not, it was a myth, the walls didn't fall down, that's all made up, it's all in the Bible. Well, through people, so he's 2,000 years back, so he's only less than 1,000 years from Jericho. Through descriptions, they have gone and found those cities and been able to dig them out and say, look, the Bible was correct, right? The Bible was correct. And so this is where we have this ammunition that we can use. Now, when we look at Josephus, this is Josephus on John the Baptist. And let's see if I can move that a little bit. It doesn't want to move, does it? This comes from Antiquities of the Jews. Now, Tammy, you asked me where you could find Antiquities of the Jews without buying a book. Well, Safari, the same app that I gave you guys every time, has three of the books of Josephus. Not all of the books, but it has three of the books, and it does have Antiquities of the Jew, and it does have the War of the Jews. When you read it, Antiquities of the Jews, it's section 18 and what we would define as maybe chapter 5, right? This is how it's actually defined in Josephus 18:5. But it's actually section 18, and then you go down to chapter 5, and then it's got a whole big long section in there as well. But here's what it says. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as righteousness towards each other and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism, for that the washing with water would be acceptable to him, if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away or the remission of sins for sins only, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. Let's see, did it not move? It didn't move. Hold on. Oh, don't tell me I locked up. Okay. I'm gonna back up. Now, when many others came in crowds about him, for they were very greatly moved or pleased by his words, Herod, who feared lest the great influence of John had over the people, might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best, by putting him to death, to prevent any mischief he might cause and not bring himself into difficulties, by sparing a man who might make him repent when it would be too late. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Macrius, the castle I mentioned before, and was there put to death. Now the Jews had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as a punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure to him. Okay. Does this vary from what the Bible says? What does the Bible say about John the Baptist? How was John the Baptist? Why was John the Baptist put to death?
Because Herodias wanted
Right.
it.
Because
Yeah.
John the Baptist had confronted him on his marriage to his brother's wife,
And his daughter.
and the daughter had incited him to give her John the Baptist's head on the platter.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But
So,
what this does is it fills in the gap of where was John actually killed.
well, and this is a question that is argued. Did Herod kill him, or was it the reason that Herod that it was put to him that they wanted him put to death, but who actually wanted him put to death and why he put to death? And so this is what Josephus writes on it. Now, remember, Josephus is writing this. Obviously, Josephus hadn't been born at the time of this, so he was recalling what had been told to him, writing about what was told to him. But let's look at what Josephus says about James, the brother of Jesus. Boy, it's being difficult to me. And now Caesar, upon hearing the deaths of Festus, we remember we talked about Festus in Acts, sent Albinus into Judea as procreator. But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession of that dignity on the son of Ananias, who was also himself called Ananias. Now the report goes that this eldest Ananias proved the most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who all performed the office of high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. But this younger Ananias, who, as we told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. So he was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders. Above all else, the rest of the Jews, as we have observed. When therefore Ananias was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to King Agrippa, desiring him to send to Ananias that he should act so no more, for that what he had already done was not to be justified. Oh, went too far. Hang on. There we go. Nay, some of them also went to meet Albinus, as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananias to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Wherefore upon Albinus complied with what they said, and wrote in anger to Ananias, and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he had done. On which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him when he had ruled but 3 months, and he made Jesus, the son of Damas, high priest. Now, Jesus was a common name. Joshua was what it would have been called, just like Jesus. Jesus today is Jesus, right? So he's now citing about James being stoned to death and saying that this was the brother of Jesus and that he was indeed stoned to death. So again, this fits right into what is cited in the New Testament, right? The writings. It backs up from a secular source what is going on in Judea at this time. So we're going to look at the destruction of the temple, and now we're going to switch to a different book. This is called the War of the Jews, and I'm going to start off in section 6, chapter 4. Titus proposed to those that they should give him their advice. Now, I'm going to give you a quick background up to this point. It shows Rome coming up against Jerusalem, and they have almost completely leveled the Jerusalem, and there is this holdout around the temple. Now, on the temple grounds, if you remember you've seen the pictures of the Temple Mount and how it had the walls all the way around the grounds. The Jews, about 6,000 had pulled back into that and were holding the temple. Titus proposed to those that they should give him their advice what should be done about the holy house. Now, some of those thought it would be best to act according to the rules of war. Now, these are the rules of war according to the Romans, and demolish it, because the Jews would never leave off rebelling while that house was standing. At which house it was they used to get all together. Others of them were the opinion that in the case the Jews would leave it and none of them would lay their arms up in it, he might save it. But in that case, they got upon it and fought anymore. But that in case they got upon it and fought anymore, he might burn it. Because it must be then looked upon not as a holy house, but as a citadel, and that the impropriety of burning it would then belong to those who forced this to be done and not to them. So what he's got two viewpoints being presented. One, normally when Rome entered a city, they leveled any temple because they believed that Caesar was God, right? So they leveled them. They didn't leave them standing, and unless they were a Roman god, they weren't allowed to be there. So that was their main armor. But here, the other people are saying, look, we can use it as a leverage against them. If they, in fact, threaten to rebel, we'll threaten to burn the temple to the ground. And we can use that against them. Well, here's what Titus had to say. But Titus said that although the Jews should get upon that holy house and fight us thence, yet ought we not to revenge ourselves upon things that are inanimate instead of the men themselves? And that he was not in any case for burning down so vast a work as that was, because it would be a mischief to the Romans themselves, as it would be an ornament to their government while it continued. So his argument is, let's leave it standing because it will be to our glory. We can use it as a part of what we are and show this magnificent temple, right, as ours, because we, in our goodness, allowed it to stand. So Titus retired into the Tower of Antonio and resolved to storm the temple the next day, early in the morning, with his whole army. If you remember when we read Acts, we talked about them putting a curtain between the temple and the citadel, the Roman citadel. That's where he was at. He was right next to the temple. But as for that house, God had for certain long ago doomed it to fire. And now that fateful day was come, according to the revolution of the ages. It was the 10th day of the month. The Roman name is Louis Ab, the 10th of Ab. You remember that's when the temple burned. The first temple was destroyed, so was the second. Upon which it was formally burnt by the king of the Babylonians. Although these flames took their rise from the Jews themselves and were occasioned by them, for upon Titus retiring, the seditious lay still for a little while and attacked the Romans again, when those that guarded the holy house fought with those that quenched the fire that was burning in the inner court of the temple. So what is going on here? Well, but these Romans put the Jews to flight and proceeded as far as the holy house itself. At which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders and without any concern or dread upon him, at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he sent the fire to the golden window, through which was a passage to the rooms that were around the holy house on the north side of it. So what happens here is Titus had stopped his advance, and he was waiting for morning. But some of those people that were inside on the Temple Mount went out and attacked the Roman soldiers. So the Roman soldiers then immediately pushed back, and they went after them and Then they threw fire in the window and started the temple on fire. Now a certain person came running to Titus and told him of this fire, as he was resting himself in the tent after the last battle. Whereupon he rose with great haste, and as he was, ran to the holy house in order to have a stop to put to the fire. After him followed all the commanders, and after them followed several legions in great astonishment. So there was a great clamor and tumult raised, as was natural upon the disorderly motion of such a great an army. Then did Caesar by calling to the soldiers that were fighting with a loud voice, and by giving a signal to them with his right hand, order them to quench the fire. So here we have Titus gets up in the middle of the night, doesn't bother to put on his armor. He runs out and does whatever he can to try and get this fire out. But by this time, because they were so astonished by the fact he ran out, didn't get all prepared, etc., they followed him. And a legion is a lot of people. That's a lot of noise, just the simple walking, let alone the fact they're running after him. He would be unable to be heard. But they did not hear what he said, though he spake so loud, having their ears already dimmed by the greater noise another way, nor did they attend to the signal he made with his hands, neither, as still some of them were distracted with fighting, and others with passion, while the holy house was on fire. Everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. So the Jews that were present, Josephus says there were 10,000 of them, and he killed them all, and they were all killed as a result. But the fact that the temple burned to the ground, Josephus is saying, well, it was God's will that it was burned to the ground. But when we look at it, the fact was that the Jewish people attacked the Romans, and then the Romans retaliated against the orders of Titus. And so the temple was destroyed, right? When we look at the actions leading up to the destruction of the temple, it's important to understand Josephus's writings, because some of his writings were intermingled with common writings of the time. They're intermingled, as you're going to see in this next passage, with the New Testament writings. They're intermingled with writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's why they say that without Josephus, you can't properly understand those writings. And that's what we're going to read. We're going to read this section, then we're going to discuss it piece by piece.
What do you mean intermingled? What do you mean by that?
What I mean is you will see commonalities in both items, right?
Okay, I thought you meant that other people took and wrote in them, changed it or whatever.
Okay, so this next, I was just looking at what Layla wrote. This next section, Josephus, is really a point that historians argue about whether he wrote it. And you'll see why when we read it. It has some clearly, when we look at it, you're going to see some clear comparisons. So let's look at this section here. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied God himself, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident, and did so plainly foretell their future desolation. But like men infatuated, without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Thus there was a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, and a comet that continued the whole year. Thus, also before the Jews' rebellion and before these commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come to the great crowds of the feast of unleavened bread, Passover, on the 8th day of the month of Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime. Thus, my computer's being fun today. There we go. Which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend these events that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival, also a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and vastly heavy, had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was there made of one entire stone, was seen to be open of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Now those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon running to the captain of the temple and told him of it, who then came up thither, and not with great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. This also appeared to be the vulgar to be very happy prodigy, as if God thereby opened the gates of happiness. But the men of learning understood it, that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was opened for the advantage of the enemies. So these publicly declared that the signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Beside these, a few days after the feast, and the 21st day of the month of Artemis, Yair, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related to those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running among the clouds and surrounding of the cities. Moreover, at that feast, which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that in the first place they felt a quaking and a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." But what is still more terrible, there was one Jesus, the son of Ananias, a plebeian and a husbandman, who for 4 years before the war began, and at the time when the city was in great peace and prosperity, came to that feast, whereon it is our custom for everyone to make tabernacles to God in the temple, Shavuot, began on a sudden to cry aloud, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, a voice against this whole people. This was his cry as he went about by day and night in all the lanes of the city. However, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, and took up the man and gave him a great number of severe stripes. Yet did not he either say anything for himself or anything particular to those that chastised him, but still went on with the same words which he cried before. Hereupon our rulers, supposing as the case proved to be that this was some sort of divine fury in the man, brought him to a Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare, yet he did not make any voice of supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible. At every stroke of the whip, his answer was, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." When Albinus, for he was then our procurator, asked who he was, and whence he came, and why he uttered such words, he made no manner of reply what he said, but still did not leave off his melancholy ditty, until Albinus took him to be a madman, and dismissed him. Now, during the times that passed before the war began, this man did not go near any of the citizens, nor was seen by them while he said so, but he every day uttered those lamentable words, as if it were premeditated vow, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." Nor did he give any ill words to those who beat him every day, nor good words to those who gave him food, but this was his reply to all men, and indeed no other than a melancholy presage of what was to come. This cry of his was the loudest at the festivals, and he continued this ditty for 7 years and 5 months, without growing hoarse or being tired, therefore until the very time when he saw his presage in the earnest fulfilled in our siege, when it ceased. For as he was going round upon the wall, he cried out with his utmost force, "Woe, woe to the city again, and to the people, and to the holy house." And just as he added the last, "Woe, woe to myself," there came a stone from one of the engines, smote him, and killed him immediately. As he was uttering the same presages, he gave up a ghost. He gave up the ghost. So here's the issue. When we look at this, it's a very long passage. I'm sorry about the length of that passage, but it's an important passage. And this is where we wonder how much time, how much Josephus knew about Jesus. Because first passage, it says, there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city. We know that's in the New Testament, over the city of Bethlehem. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was interpreted by the sacred scribes to portend those events that followed it. Right? So here the people in knowledge and the wise men came from the east and acknowledged that. And it brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. So as we continue to look at this, we see these in his writing where he seems to have been very aware of who Jesus was, what was being said about him, the history of him, and he wove it into this tapestry. Chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running among the clouds at that feast which we call Pentecost. And they felt a great shaking and heard a great noise. And after that, they heard a sound of the great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." So again, we see the same images repeated over and over in Josephus' work. When it came to that fast, and there was one Jesus, when it came to that fast, it is custom for everyone to make tabernacles to God, begin on a sudden to cry aloud, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, and a voice against his holy people. So we hear the message that is given, and John repeats this message, right? In Revelation, certain of the eminent people of the populace had great indignation and took up the man. So here we're talking about the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin. He took up this man and gave him a great number of severe stripes, yet he did not say either anything for himself or anything particular to those that chastised them, but still went on with the same words as he cried out before. And it says they brought him to a Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare, yet he did not make supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible, At every
David.
stroke of those whip, his answer was, woe, woe to Jerusalem. Yes, Eli.
A procreator is a father. A procurator is what you're trying to say.
Procreator, you're correct.
No,
Yeah.
procurator. It's like curing something.
Procurator. I got it.
There you go.
I'll keep working on it. So when we look at this, do we not see this in the New Testament, the Brit Kadishah? Was he not taken to a Roman procurator and whipped 39 lashes, right? They were only allowed to do 39 lashes at one time. And so he received 39 lashes. But those 39 lashes, the one thing I will say about the movie The Passion of Christ, that otherwise is a very Catholic movie, when they show the beating of Jesus with the whips, it was one of the most realistic I've seen. And yet it was probably toned down because they wouldn't dare do what would actually happen. And how bad all those blades, pieces of steel, tearing chunks of flesh out of the body. The pain is insane. And they ask him who he was and whence he came from, and why did he utter these words? But he made no manner of reply, nor did he give ill words to any of those who beat him every day, nor good words to those that gave him food. But this was the reply to all men, indeed no other than a melancholy presage of what was to come. So when we look at the teaching of Josephus, the writings of Josephus, we can clearly see that he was aware of the apostles, of Christianity, of who Jesus was. Now there is an argument among academics that this whole section that I just read was added much, much later. And they believe it was changed to Jesus of Ananias in order to keep from reflecting directly on Jesus, the Messiah. And there's a few tweaks to the story. But if you look at the story, it stands on its own, right? And that's why reading Josephus is important to understand. And Josephus is cited a lot in the Talmud. He's foundational on it. So if you really want to understand some of the sayings in the Talmud, you have to understand and read Josephus. Now, again, I used this app, which you can do online. You don't have to have an app. You can do it on your computer. Safari. There we go. It is a great app. You can just ask for Josephus it's all the way down in the bottom right corner. For me, it's something that I use considerably because it allows me to search. It's searchable, right? The biggest problem with if you don't the greatest gain today, if you want to search a Talmud, you get a digital version and it's 100% searchable, right? Makes it much easier to find. If you haven't spent 10 years studying Talmud, you can shortcut that 10 years of learning and go right to each one of those sites. Now, what it will not give you is the background to be able to properly interpret what you're reading. You can sometimes end up taking stuff out of context. And that's what I really want you to understand, that it gets taken out of context. It's something that when you study, always read the context. I took those verses out of context. I took those sections out of context because I didn't want to spend 3 hours or 4 hours going through those exact texts. But if you go back and you read it and you understand it, then you really get a lot out of it. Layla, you want to explain about who Eusebius was?
Eusebius.
Eusebius, there we go. My Greek is
No.
terrible.
Anyway, he was also a historian. He was he was writing at about 300, and he condensed Josephus. That's where he got most of his material. I was merely saying that Josephus has several volumes, and he goes on and on and on, and then on some more. And after about a week of reading Josephus, you go, you see, Eusebius is only this big. He cuts out a lot, but you get an overview.
Yeah, I spent. Go ahead.
Josephus is great, but if you don't have a week to go into it, Eusebius is okay.
I spent 10 weeks at the university on Josephus. One full quarter
Yes.
on Josephus.
Yes.
And we only dealt with antiquities of the Jews. We didn't even deal with war. One book, 10 weeks, 3 hours, 3 times a week.
Yes.
And we covered.
Yes, that's what I'm
antiquities.
talking about. Eusebius, you could read it in 2 evenings, and
Right.
it doesn't say everything, but it says it's a good summary.
Yeah. So to me, a lot of times use it as a reference. Use the app that I gave you, the site that I gave you as a reference material. Go back and you can find this material. If you just try to read it, you're going to spend months reading it and not understand it. That's the hardest problem, because I was reading one of the most updated versions, and as you could tell, I was having difficulty reading it. And that's out of my college textbook. It's not real simple. And when you go back into older writings, translations, it's even harder to read and understand. You really have to parse it out. And but I hope that
Do you think
this,
that's partly
Huh?
from the? Do you think that's partly from the translating of it? Because it seems to be like I've translated Spanish before, and it seems to be like that. You know, where your sentences are kind of backwards. The things that they're saying are
Yeah.
written like you wouldn't probably write it, not very active. So I
Right.
wonder if it's translation that.
well, if I remember right, it was originally written in Greek and then in Latin. And then they started making translations off of that. Tacitus was only written in Latin, right? The one that Layla mentioned was written in Latin, right? So you have to at least, if you're going to read original, you have to understand Latin. But that's not my forte. I can't speak English, so. But I hope it helped learn some of these two historians. If you really want to dive deep into them, into Josephus is used by rabbis everywhere as the foundation to explain the statements in the Talmud. Tacitus is used mostly by historians and Christian historians because it deals a lot with the persecution of the church. I didn't include any of it, but if you read it, it talks a lot about how the church persecution of that time period, of what was going on with Rome. So let's end with prayer and call it a night, guys. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for allowing us to have this dialogue and discussion and the tools that are available to us to better understand the message that you've given. And I thank you for the life-giving truth that you have given us through your son, Yeshua, and that redemption that is available only through him. And I thank you in the name of your son. Amen.